Confronting the Constitution in the United States, the armed standoff in Oregon enters its second week. Self-styled militiamen are refusing to end their stand against government control of land and their lives. With no end in sight, what's needed for a peaceful resolution here? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme with me, Peter Dobby. Now, Eastern Oregon is a part of the US that's not often in the news. It is thinly populated and is mostly vast open space. It's even called the High Desert. But all of a sudden, we've been seeing a lot of it. Armed protesters have been occupying a government-owned wildlife refuge for more than a week now. And they say they don't plan on leaving until their demands are met.
We're prepared to be out here for as long as needs be.
It's happening near the small town of Burns, and the protesters, a mix of farmers, ranchers and survivalists, are angry about what they see as excessive federal control over their lives. They say the government is applying even stricter regulations on land they need for cattle grazing. Federal land management policies are, they say, unfair to people struggling to make a living in the area.
We didn't come here to be activists. We came, and we're not doing this to be activists. We're making a stand on the Constitution, and we have work that needs to be done. We need to be able to unwind all these unconstitutional transactions. And basically the plan here is to take all of these property titles and transfer them back to the people. To take them out of the federal government's hands, because they're not constitutionally allowed to be there, and to transfer them, do a title transfer back to the people.
Well, this dispute may seem rather small town, but it has stirred a nationwide debate on the government's relatively slow response to the standoff, on the wider issue of its control over land in the western US, and on how federal authorities interact with local communities. The government controls more than half the land in Oregon and almost 85% in Nevada. Ranchers who want to work that land have to pay for permits, which can get expensive. And in recent decades, the government has increasingly restricted mining, grazing and ranching on its land in a push to abide by stronger environmental laws. OK, let's get the thoughts now of our guests. In Burns, Oregon, Pete Santilli, spokesman for the ranchers in the Oregon standoff. In Salt Lake City, Eric Ethington, communications director at Political Research Associates. And in Washington, D.C., Matt Lee Ashley, senior fellow and director of public lands at the Center for American Progress. Welcome to Inside Story. Peter, why did they feel they had to do this?
The United States government has taken millions of acres of land unconstitutional land. And that for many, many decades now, especially here in Burns, Oregon, over 100 ranchers since 1908 have literally been terrorized and run off of this land under the guise of protecting the environment, which we all want to do, of course, but all in the effort to seize the mineral and water rights and the land rights, and to block out the use of this land for the public benefit, and it's a seizure that is intolerable. These ranchers, there's a few remaining, and they consider it to be a time that we need to stop and restore what the Constitution intended as to the U.S. government's ownership of land. It's very, very specific, but these lands here have been taken from the ranchers, and it's time to bring them back to the people.
Do they really believe they can achieve that, though?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I've been in town now for over a week. It's only going to take place with the support of the people. The people are being educated through this constitutional crisis. People are shocked here in Burns, Oregon, what the Constitution itself actually says. Even the students here are becoming actively involved in opening up the Constitution, reading Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 17, and they're also learning about the true constitutional powers of the county sheriff. These are things that they didn't realize until this demonstration brought it to the forefront here within the past week. People are shocked, but at the same time, they're very, very empowered.
Eric, one of the combustible components here goes back a few years. Father and son deliberately set fire to a big acreage. I think it was 140 acres plus. They are found guilty of that. The judge on appeal sends them to prison for a lesser tariff than he should have done. And then a higher court says, no, actually, you guys are going back to jail. How rare is that process?
Well, it's interesting that what they are being prosecuted under is actually the a 1996 terrorism law. But, you know, what's interesting here is what we're really seeing is a battle for PR and fundraising supremacy between these various patriot movement paramilitary organizations that are involved. The 3%ers and members of the Oath Keepers were the ones who initially stepped in and organized that march in protest of the Hammonds arrest or the jailing of the Hammonds. But then they were very concerned, or I guess put off, when the Bundys and these other militants instigated the armed takeover of the refuge. So now they're stepping back in and really just trying to get back into the limelight to boost their own fundraising.
Sorry, Eric, just to be clear, the 3%ers, who are we talking about?
The Idaho 3%ers, this is one of the lesser known players in the Patriot movement world. They are the primary organization behind what we're now hearing called the Pacific Patriot Network.
Okay, Matt Lee
They're the
Ashley.
ones stepping in to form the barricade.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Matt Lee Ashley in Washington. Is the land legislation inherently flawed here? Is it out of kilter or almost out of step with itself?
So let's just be clear about what we're talking about here. We're talking about national forests, national wildlife refuges, public lands, national monuments. In the U.S., these are our public lands. These belong to every taxpayer in the United States. This effort in Oregon is a seizure of those public lands. It's an effort to transfer ownership from all of us, the taxpayers, to a set of special interest groups. Whether that effort will be successful legislatively, I think not. Public opinion in the West is clearly stacked against that effort, partly because state governments can't afford the cost of paying for wildfires, abandoned mine cleanups, etc. And certainly this effort on the ground in Oregon, it will end with people in jail for storming a federal building with guns, and it should end that way, with people being held accountable under the law.
Peter, I mean, our other two contributors have identified exactly the problem here. What your colleagues are doing inside that compound is magnetic for exactly the wrong types. And also, there's an election around the corner. If you want to change the law, why stage a takeover? Why not get someone to stand on a political ticket during the election campaign?
I want to comment on Eric's remarks that that this is an effort to conduct a fundraising campaign and a PR campaign. Obviously, bringing public awareness on behalf of the grassroots is very, very important. We don't have the luxury of the full force of the government, the billions and billions of dollars it would have to run people off of the land as they have with ranchers since 1908. Bringing public awareness on behalf of the grassroots effort here is a very, very noble thing. To do fundraising through We the People is also a noble thing as well. We're not going to use the government kitty as the left wing seems to have full access to, unlimited resources in that regard. Now, taking over and seizing this land, quite frankly, what they did, it's actually almost an embarrassment to the other side. They actually just walked in and made themselves comfortable. I would say that the U.S. government is extremely embarrassed. There are no trespassing signs there. They just walked on. It just so happened that in the public they mentioned the guns, and that certainly created a lot of controversy.
Eric, this idea of the anti-terrorism legislation that goes back to 1996, I mean, people like Peter might say to me now, well, they've been prosecuted and they are also being persecuted. If you accept that rationale, was there another piece of legislation that could have been deployed so the legislation that was used wasn't so incendiary?
Well, it is an unfortunate trend in the country that the terrorism laws have been so broadly and wantonly applied in many instances and turned inwards on the United States rather than outwards. But I do want to respond with this idea that they are fighting the good fight, that this is a grassroots movement in Oregon for these public lands. It really isn't. Unfortunately, with many of these Patriot Movement groups, this has become their really what they are known for, to step into a local community where they're really not wanted. These are not local members of Oregon who are inside these federal buildings. They're not the Idaho 3%ers who have stepped in. In fact, the local residents of Oregon held a town hall just the other night where they overwhelmingly voted saying, get out, we don't want you here. You are distracting from the legitimate economic grievances that we really have.
May I comment? May I comment on that, Eric? First of all, I've been on the ground for a week. There is overwhelming public support. There's a silent majority. Ranchers who I've witnessed coming in droves every few minutes, providing supplies. People that have been speaking to me, telling me, make sure you let the family know. We are in full support. We've been waiting decades for something like this to happen.
If they're the silent majority, just to interrupt you for a second, Peter, if they are the silent majority, how do you know they're there? By definition, they're not saying anything.
Because they're coming to me. I can't even drive down the street without them pulling me aside and telling me that they are in such fear of retribution and retaliation. They can't go on camera. They can't speak out. Over 50% of the people here work for the U.S. government. Of course they can't speak out. They've been threatened not to speak out. And also these meetings where you're seeing in front of the camera people raising their hands in support of the sheriff, asking them to leave. That was completely and totally staged. It's called the Delphi technique. They knew what the narrative was. They knew exactly who they had to have in that room to seek consensus. It was a pre-staged event. They used these military tactics in Afghanistan and Iraq to manipulate the populace to get that consensus and make them feel like they're part of a democratic process. There's a very, very slim minority of individuals that are in front of the cameras to suit the government narrative.
Picking up on that point of narrative, Matt Lee Ashley in Washington. Sorry, pardon me, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's really important to understand where the support for these folks in Oregon is coming from. I think you're hearing from Peter on the ground there that, yes, there is a faction of militias and right-wing anti-government groups that are out there being represented. They're fueling some of the on-the-ground conflicts, the illegal actions. But there's also another special interest group that is driving the campaign to transfer, seize, and sell America's public lands. That's funded in part by the Koch brothers, the billionaire Koch brothers. It is supported by some of the Republican presidential candidates. So we're seeing an alignment of some very right-wing anti-government extremism and some special interest groups that are eager to get their hands on minerals, timber, and oil and gas under public lands and to transfer public lands into private ownership. So it is an unusual alliance that we're seeing here play out on the ground. But overwhelmingly, if you poll, the polls of Westerners show very clearly that the majority of people who live in the West don't want to see this fundamental reshaping of the landscape out there because American lands in the West drive economies, they attract tourism, they create jobs, and what we're talking about here is a fundamentally radical idea that is in the headlines because gunmen have stormed a refuge in Oregon.
Well, gentlemen, this isn't the first time a land rights dispute has escalated to this kind of point. Eamon Bundy's father, in fact, had a similar standoff with federal agents when he was illegally grazing cattle on government land in Nevada 2 years ago. Almost exactly a year later, militiamen showed up in Medford, Oregon, allegedly to protect mine owners from the government. They said federal agents were going to destroy the mines. A few months later, militiamen came to the defense of mine owners again, this time in a small Montana town called Lincoln. And those are only a few examples. Anti-government militia groups have reportedly grown by more than 1/3 in the last year alone. Peter Santilli, if Mr. Bundy is such a fine, upstanding citizen, why does he owe the government more than $1 million US in taxes and fees? What gives him the luxury, just let me get to the point, what gives him the luxury of saying, no, I have no money in the bank, my job is not providing an income I can live off, therefore I'm going to stop paying what I'm due?
Actually, he has the money in escrow. He's attempted to pay it to to the state of Nevada because he believes that the land belongs to the people of the state of Nevada. It's not a luxury when you have the government through the IRS or through the BLM by force coming down upon any rancher, putting a price tag on their head, making it almost impossible to even work with them. He refuses to work with them. He doesn't want to pay his check. I've seen the check. The state could not apply it because they deferred to the federal government. Back to the point about the quote, the armed takeover, and the person in Washington, D.C. obviously trembling in his voice. He feels very, very uncomfortable about what he said. These are individuals, the people that have come to the aid of those on the inside. The federal government is setting the stage right now, just like they did in Waco, to kill these individuals on the inside for trespassing. Now, the quote-unquote militia, if that's what gets them, especially this guy in Washington, D.C., concerned, we, the people, will come to the defense of these individuals because we don't believe that they deserve to die for maximum trespassing.
Okay, I'm just going to close you down for a second, Peter, because you have kind of had a very good run at what you're trying to get your message across with here. Just going to Eric. Peter, I will come back to you. I really will, I promise you. Eric, Peter mentioned Waco there. What are the chances here that we see a flashpoint, that the federal government, that the FBI must be anticipating in some senses? You mentioned Waco, Peter, because, okay, Waco was something completely different. That was the Davidian branch cult. That was some people doing some things that couldn't really be understood. But the authorities went in, that ended in disaster. And then off the back of that, we saw Timothy McVeigh doing what he did at the Oklahoma City bombing.
That's right. You know, following Waco and Ruby Ridge, for those of us who watch the right wing, who examine and study it, what we have seen is that perhaps it is unwritten. I can't say that this is documented, but what it appears to be is that there is now an unwritten rule among federal law enforcement officers that when right wing, primarily white, patriot or militia groups step in and start to organize things like this, it really is a hands-off approach. They don't want a repeat of what happened back in the 90s because they saw how that ended. It's very different if protesters tend to be people of color, but for right-wing organizations, it's really handled with kid gloves. But I want to address something that Peter said when he talked about they're there to just fight the good fight, to step in. If we really examine who these groups are, such as the Idaho 3%ers, who have the ones who have made the most noise in the last day or so, this is a paramilitary group that is known for very violent rhetoric. The founder of the group has called for smashing windows at the DNC. They have published personal information of legislators who support gun control. They've made threats against the governor of Oregon. And in fact, their supporters or those who are affiliated with them have really come out in the last year. You had the militant who shot at a Black Lives Matter protest in Minnesota. You had the couple who shot cops and bystanders in Las Vegas following the Bundy Ranch. You had another who made a bomb threat against the Arkansas State University. This is a very violently motivated network. In fact, the Idaho 3%ers themselves, in the last year, they have held armed protests in Idaho based on an Islamophobic message protesting Syrian refugees.
Eric, that is not true, and I've also put a call out, since you call it a white thing. You haven't been on the ground here. You don't know what the makeup is of the individuals that are on the ground.
Our researchers have been on the ground for about 6 months. It's months longer than you have been there for about a week, sir.
Let me finish my point. I'm calling upon all of the individuals that I stood in the streets of Baltimore fighting for their constitutional rights, in Cleveland. I'm calling upon them to come here constitutionally, lawfully, and stand with us. And actually, we're able to, once we get the land back in the possession of the people here in Harney County.
Peter, the reality is we live in a nation of laws here. I'm sorry, we live in a nation of laws, and if people disagree with the land management strategy, there is a forum to take that on, and that's through our democracy, through Congress.
Can I finish my point? I want to call upon all of the grassroots Black Lives Matter people to come out here because there's more jobs out here than there are in the inner city selling heroin on behalf of Barack Obama's trafficking network.
Peter, you didn't actually mention, or you didn't react to the point that Eric was making. He was talking specifically about one individual, and this program, Inside Story, has tried to contact this individual. He's the chap who's got the stars and stripes tattooed on his chest, and he goes to meetings with highly offensive logos and
He loves whipping you up into a tornadic, in independent media. If he can create some controversy and get
he
those
doesn't
on
do
the
it very
left.
well, because I think he had 7 followers on Twitter, and then he killed his Twitter account. That is a different conversation. If the federal government, I'm going to stop you there. If the federal government crosses a line with the people who are inside that compound, what might that line be? At what point do they feel, at what point do your colleagues inside the compound think we have to now use our guns?
The people in the compound won't have to worry about that, because there's millions of people on the outside of the compound that will protect them. They've already made a mistake. And the reason why Idaho 3%ers, who, by the way, are led by somebody who's got 11 years of law enforcement experience, a lot of these people are military vets, honorably discharged. These are not the radicals that this guy on the left side of the political spectrum would like to paint that picture. But the sheriff's department is already messed up. Those guys would not be here if the sheriff would have simply responded to a couple of security issues out here. Also, the FBI and the sheriff's department were posturing to go in there to use all of their millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars in equipment through their surveillance. They were going to go into a compound that's 30 miles away from any potential safety issue, but they did not respond to any safety issues because they are cowering in fear. They believe that we mean harm to the public. The Idaho 3%ers will stand as a neutral entity to defend the demonstrators, defend and protect the public, as well as law enforcement, because they lack the courage to come out and deal with minor physical altercations.
Eric, the guys who've seized the compound, I'm going to stop you again, Peter. Eric, the guys that have seized the compound, they're on record. Peter said it today. We will stay here as long as we possibly can. That simply cannot become the status quo. So, what do the authorities do?
It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I don't know what the FBI or the DOJ is planning on doing. Looking at the past records since the early 90s, based on what has happened previously, most likely they'll just stay hands off and wait for them to go away and go home. But, the level of rhetoric that's coming out here, the Patriot movement since the 90s has been dominated primarily by conspiracy theorists, anti-abortion activists, right-wing libertarians, and members of the Christian right. This is not a movement based on rational or constitutional principles, despite how often they may want to use that word.
I would say that's right out of your Saul Alinsky's book of radicals. What you just did is so far from reality and the truth. It's just textbook Saul Alinsky. This is how we attack our opponents. It's so not even close to reality.
30 seconds each. 30 seconds each. We're almost out of time. Right to left. Matt, will this end well or will this end badly?
It's too early to say. Hopefully, the gunmen on the ground will come to their senses and leave peacefully and follow the rule of law and be held accountable for their actions. But we also have a broader challenge here, which is that the storyline here now seems to be about some very armed radical militants taking over a national wildlife refuge. That actually is in contrast with the vast majority of the relationship that the federal government has with states and local communities. Most decisions about land management in the West are based on consensus and collaboration.
Eric, will it end well or will it end terribly badly?
I think it's going to accomplish exactly what these paramilitary groups want. They're going to get their names in the press, and the emails are already going out. Their fundraising is going to succeed, and they'll bring in more money. Who it's going to end badly for are actually the locals in these rural communities who are having some of their actually legitimate economic grievances distracted by these organizations.
Peter, you're talking to another agenda. You're not going to get what you want.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. Constitution is non-negotiable. And unlike Eric, who has unlimited access to government resources to do what he did in this program, we will, through the grassroots, we will educate the public. fundraising, if it's supported by the local populace. The bottom line is it will be resolved.
Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us here on Inside Story. Peter Santilli in Burns, Eric Ethington in Salt Lake City, and Matt Lee Ashley talking to us out of our bureau in Washington, D.C. And thank you to you for your time today. As always, you can leave your comments on the programme's page of our website, aljazeera.com. You can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us, AJ Inside Story. Tweet me, AJ Dobbs. From me, Peter Dobby, and the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll do it all again, usual times, tomorrow. Bye-bye.